My husband made me sign a prenup to protect his assets. I agreed without argument. Years later, after he cheated, I handed him divorce papers. And he froze when he realized who really owned everything. The air was thick with tension as I stared at Scott, his face contorted with confusion. He was sitting across from me in the lawyer's office, his eyes scanning the divorce papers I had just handed him. I had expected anger or perhaps frustration, but what I saw in his eyes was something entirely different. Fear. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of uncertainty, but as he read the words printed on the papers, it became clear. His entire demeanor shifted. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped the documents, and his usually cocky smile began to falter. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction stir within me. Scott had no idea what was coming, and yet here he was, the man who thought he had it all under control. The man who thought he could manipulate everything and everyone around him for his own benefit. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When I first married him, I believed in us, in the life we were building. We were supposed to be partners, equals. But somewhere along the way he had turned that partnership into a one-sided game, one where only his rules mattered. And I had let him. But not anymore. Before we continue, I just want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for being part of this journey. Your support means so much. If you're enjoying this content, don't forget to subscribe. It's free and helps us grow this incredible community. Let's get started. As he continued to read the words on the page, I could feel the tension in my body rise. This was it, the moment when everything would change. The moment when the carefully constructed world we had built together would come crashing down. My hands were steady as I watched him, but inside my heart was racing. I had waited for this moment for so long, the day when I would finally be free, when I would no longer be trapped by his lies, his cheating and his manipulation. The day when I would take back everything he thought I had lost. I had never intended for things to end this way. The Scott I had married was not the man sitting before me now. Back then he was kind, charming, thoughtful even. But somewhere along the way his ego had ballooned. And when his wealth started to grow, so did his sense of entitlement. It was subtle at first, just little things here and there that didn't sit right with me. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way he started treating me like I was disposable. He had begun to believe that because of his success he was untouchable. But I wasn't blind. I saw what was happening and I knew what it meant. He was cheating on me. I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of revealing itself, and when it did, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had found the evidence. Messages, receipts, photos, and they all led back to one conclusion. Scott had betrayed me. But what was worse than his infidelity was how he justified it. When I confronted him, he laughed it off as though it didn't matter. "You'll get over it," he said. "You'll be fine. You signed that prenup, remember?" His words were cold, almost mocking. The prenup, the one thing he'd convinced me to sign before we even got married, was his shield. It protected him, or so he thought. But now, sitting here across from him, I knew the truth. The power was in my hands, not his. He had no idea what I had been quietly doing in the background for the past few months. He had thought I was defeated, that I would bow down to his manipulation and continue to play my role as the loyal, obedient wife. But he had underestimated me, and that was his biggest mistake. As Scott finally looked up from the divorce papers, I saw the panic in his eyes. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning realization that he was about to lose everything. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't. This isn't possible." His fingers were shaking as he fumbled with the papers, trying to make sense of what was happening. It was at that moment that I saw it. The fear. Not just in his eyes, but in the way his posture changed, the way he shrank into the chair. He had built his empire on lies, on manipulation, on the assumption that he could control everyone around him. But now his carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Don't worry, Scott," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet power. "You thought you had it all. You thought I was the one who would walk away with nothing. But you were wrong. You should have thought about that before you started playing games with me." He tried to protest, to argue, but it was too late. The damage had been done. His cheating, his lies, it all came rushing back to him in that one moment. He had used me, taken advantage of me, and now he would pay the price. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel sadness. What I felt in that moment was liberation. I had waited for so long to take control of my life again, to step out from under his shadow, and now I was finally free. The satisfaction that coursed through me was not born out of vengeance but out of justice. I had been betrayed, but I had also been patient. I had played my cards right, and now Scott was going to learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything. As he continued to stare at the papers, I could see the gears turning in his mind. He was trying to calculate his next move to find a way out. But there was no escape. His arrogance had led him to believe that he was invincible, that nothing could touch him. But now he was facing the consequences of his actions, and for the first time he realized that he was not in control anymore. For a brief moment our eyes met, and in that instant, everything was clear. I had won. It wasn't just the assets, the house, the money. It was the power. The power to walk away from a life that no longer served me, from a man who had taken everything and given nothing in return. And as I stood up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. Scott had lost. And I had finally gained back what was mine. The door clicked shut behind me, and as I stepped into the hallway, I took a deep breath, the weight of the past few months lifting off my shoulders. I was done. Scott would never have the power over me again. Not now, not ever. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I had made it. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, I had already claimed victory. I could feel the weight of the years of silence, the years of being overlooked, finally lifting. But how did I get here? How had it come to this point? To understand where I was now, I had to look back at the beginning, at the choices I made, the love I thought I had, and the betrayal that would unravel everything. Scott and I met when I was just starting out. I was fresh out of college, eager, passionate, with big dreams and a small apartment. I had been raised to believe that love could overcome anything, that if you worked hard enough and loved deeply enough, everything else would fall into place. Scott seemed like a dream come true. He was handsome, confident, and had a magnetic presence. The kind of person people wanted to be around. He had that touch of arrogance, the kind that made him irresistible. He wasn't just rich, he was privileged. His family had money, and he carried that weight with him in his words, his actions, and the way he treated others. At first it was all about the charm. The dinners at expensive restaurants, the spontaneous weekend getaways, the late-night talks under the stars about our dreams and our future. It all felt so perfect, so right. He made me feel like I was the center of his universe, like nothing else mattered as long as we were together. He had that way of making you believe in the fantasy, in the fairy tale. It was easy to fall in love with him, and I did. Completely. But things started to change as we got more serious. Scott's ambition grew, as did his ego. At first, I didn't notice the subtle shifts. The way he started talking more about his family's business, about expanding his wealth, and how everything in his life seemed to revolve around accumulating more. More power, more money, more control. I should have seen it then, but I didn't. I was too caught up in the dream he painted for me. The dream of a perfect life with the perfect man. Then came the day he brought up the prenup. We had been together for almost a year by then, and everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. He was talking about marriage, about settling down, about spending our lives together. But then he pulled out the paper. I remember the moment so clearly, the way he slid the document across the table with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just for our protection, Elise," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You know how important my family's business is. We can't risk anything happening, not after everything we've worked for. This is just to keep us both safe." I sat there, staring at the prenup in front of me, the words written on the paper blurring together. I didn't know much about legal matters, and the way he spoke made it sound like it was the most logical, reasonable thing in the world. In his world it made sense. In his world, where assets, inheritance, and family legacies meant everything, the prenup was a necessary precaution. But in my world, where love and trust were supposed to be the foundation of a marriage, it felt like something was being taken away before it even started. I remember thinking about it for only a few moments, but in those moments I was torn. My instincts told me something wasn't right, that something was off. But my heart, my hopeful heart, told me that it was just a formality, something to get out of the way so we could move forward with our life together. And so I signed it. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I trusted him, and that was my mistake. The years that followed felt like a blur. Scott's business took off, and so did his confidence, his arrogance. The more successful he became, the more distant he grew. It started small, little things like him working late more often or dismissing my concerns about the way he was treating people. But the more I tried to push back, the more I found myself shrinking in his presence. He was the star and I was just there to support him, to stand beside him and make sure the world saw the perfect couple we were supposed to be. But inside I was fading. Then came the moment that changed everything. The moment I found out the truth. The messages. The receipts. The photos. All of them pointed to one thing: he was seeing someone else. And not just anyone. Someone who wasn't just a mistake, someone who was entangled in his world, someone who was a part of his life that he didn't want me to see. When I confronted him, his reaction was cold, calculating, and dismissive. "You'll be fine, Elise," he said, as if my world wasn't falling apart around me. "You signed the prenup. You know how this works." Those words hit me harder than I had ever expected. You signed the prenup. It was as though, in his eyes, I was nothing more than a footnote in the grand scheme of his wealth and status. I had always known there was a divide between us, the way he treated money and the way I had been raised to view it. But in that moment I realized just how deep that divide ran. To Scott, the prenup wasn't just a piece of paper. It was his way of ensuring that I never stood a chance. It was his way of locking me out of the life he had built for himself, a life I had helped create. But the most painful part was the realization that he didn't love me. Not in the way I had loved him. I had always been his partner, but I had never truly been seen. I had given everything to this marriage, sacrificed my own dreams, my own identity to build something for us. And now I was nothing more than a pawn in his game. And so I began to plan. It wasn't a decision I made in haste. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted justice. The prenup had given him the illusion of control, but I wasn't going to let him think that I was helpless, that I was powerless in this situation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't need him. In fact, I had been the one holding everything together all along. I started looking into everything: his business, the investments, the assets. I consulted with financial experts, digging into the documents, the contracts, the loopholes I could exploit. Slowly, methodically, I began to take control. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't afraid. I had built this life too, and I would take back what was rightfully mine. The road ahead wasn't going to be simple. But for the first time in a long time I felt alive again. The love I once had for Scott had faded, replaced by something more powerful: empowerment. I wasn't just a wife anymore. I was a woman who had regained control over her own destiny, and I would not allow Scott or anyone else to take that away from me again. The days following my discovery were a blur. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, sorrow, and disbelief. How could Scott, the man I had built my life with, betray me so completely? How could someone I trusted with everything, someone who had promised to cherish me forever, shatter that trust so effortlessly? It was as though the man I had known and loved no longer existed. What remained was a stranger, someone cold, calculating, and indifferent to the pain he had caused. The first few nights after I found out, I couldn't sleep. I'd toss and turn, my mind racing, replaying every moment, every conversation, every detail. Was I so blind? How had I missed all the signs? There had been whispers, little things that never seemed like enough to confront. His late nights at the office, his sudden distance, the vague excuses for being unavailable. But I had trusted him. I had always believed in the best of him, hoping that the man I loved would be the one who showed up at the end of the day. But now all of that was shattered. Every word, every promise, every dream we had shared felt like a lie. The messages, the receipts, the photographs, it was all too real. I wasn't imagining things. He had been seeing her, and worse, he had been doing it under my nose. And I had been too trusting, too absorbed in my own world to notice. It wasn't just his infidelity that hurt. It was the realization that he had been living a double life, a life that didn't include me, a life where I was nothing more than a bystander. I couldn't bring myself to confront him immediately. Part of me was afraid of what I would say, what I would do if I saw him face to face. So I kept my distance. I buried myself in the work I had been putting off for years. Planning, organizing, and analyzing. I had to find a way out. I had to regain control, not just of my life but of everything else that had been taken from me. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was financial. He had used me, exploited my loyalty and love, all while hiding behind a wall of wealth and status. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had let him. I had been complicit in my own misery, choosing to believe in a dream instead of facing the reality of the man I had married. It was hard, so incredibly hard, to come to terms with the fact that the man I loved was capable of such betrayal. But once the shock started to fade, the anger began to take its place. I was furious. Furious with him for the lies, the deceit, the audacity to think that I would never find out. Furious with myself for not seeing the truth sooner. I spent days lost in thought, pacing the house, trying to make sense of everything. I was so deeply hurt, so broken, that it felt like my heart was being ripped out of my chest. But as time passed, something inside me shifted. The sadness slowly morphed into something else, into a determination, a resolve that I hadn't known I had. I wasn't going to let him win. I wasn't going to let him walk all over me, let him think that his wealth and status gave him the right to treat me like this. I wasn't going to play the role of the victim anymore. I would take back what was mine. I would take back everything he had stolen from me, the trust, the respect, the love, and I would make sure he felt the consequences of his actions. So I began planning. I didn't rush into anything. I didn't want to act on impulse, not when I had the upper hand. The first step was simple. I had to gather evidence. Not just about his affair, but about everything. His assets, his investments, his business dealings. I needed to know everything. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about gaining control of my own life, about leveling the playing field. The prenup he had convinced me to sign all those years ago had always made me feel small, insignificant. But now it was going to be my weapon. I couldn't do it alone. I consulted with a lawyer, a woman who understood the complexities of divorce and asset division. Together we combed through the details, finding every loophole, every potential advantage. The more we uncovered, the more I realized how much I had been taken for granted. The businesses, the investments, the properties, everything had been built on my hard work, my sacrifices. Scott had always been the face, the one people saw in the press, the one who made the big deals. But I had been the one behind the scenes, managing the finances, keeping everything running smoothly. And now I was going to make sure that I got what I deserved. As I moved forward with my plan, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of power. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. I wasn't the naive wife, the one who had been kept in the dark. I was Elise, a woman who had built a life and was no longer willing to let someone else dictate her future. The more I worked, the more I realized just how much Scott had taken from me, how much he had used me. And the more I worked, the more determined I became to make sure he paid the price. But as I continued with my preparations, something unexpected happened. I started to see a different side of Scott. He hadn't come home that night or the next. His absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He seemed to be unraveling, not in the way I expected, but in a way that made me question everything. He was distant, cold, and when he did come home, he seemed more concerned about his image than about what had actually happened between us. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg for my forgiveness. Instead, he acted as though it was all just a minor setback, something that could easily be fixed. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. Not this time. One night he sat me down, his voice shaky but controlled, as if he was trying to convince both of us that everything would be fine. He said he had made a mistake, that he wanted to work things out, but I could see right through him. His words were empty and his gestures felt forced. He was a man who had been caught, but he wasn't ready to face the consequences of his actions. And as I looked at him, I realized just how much I had underestimated myself. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I first signed that prenup. I was stronger now, wiser. And I wasn't about to let him off the hook, not now, not ever. The next day I continued with my plan, more determined than ever. I knew what needed to be done. The betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it had also awakened something inside me, a fire that wouldn't be extinguished. I would fight for what was mine, and I would make sure Scott understood the true cost of his actions. The days that followed Scott's cold apologies felt like a slow-burning fuse, leading to something far more explosive than either of us could have anticipated. As he carried on with his usual routine, pretending like everything was fine, I continued my work in silence. My anger had not yet fully subsided, but it was transforming into something more powerful, something more calculated. It was no longer just about revenge for the sake of getting back at him. It was about justice, about reclaiming what was mine, and about showing Scott that I was not the helpless, naive woman he had always thought me to be. I spent the next few days meticulously planning my next steps. I couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every action needed to be carefully thought out. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal I had to deal with anymore. It was the reality of the financial mess he had dragged me into, the weight of the prenup still hanging over my head, and the trust that had been irrevocably broken. My first priority was to ensure that I had every legal and financial angle covered. I reached out to my lawyer, going over every clause in the prenup, examining every detail of our assets. With every meeting I felt more empowered. This wasn't just about a simple divorce. This was about taking back what had always been mine, only hidden behind Scott's facade. I knew the game Scott was playing. He wasn't the type to admit defeat, not easily anyway. He believed in the power of his name, his wealth, and his family's reputation. But what he didn't know was that I had been working quietly, slowly, to level the playing field. I had taken control of the things he had once used to keep me in check. The investments, the businesses, the shares that were tied to his success. They were all now carefully restructured under my name, hidden away, safeguarded from his prying eyes. The more I learned, the more I realized just how much Scott had underestimated me. I had been his silent partner all these years, running the operations of his companies, managing the finances and keeping things running smoothly. But now I was taking everything that had been built on my efforts and making sure it would never again fall under his control. I had done the hard work while he basked in the glory of the success we had created together. And now I was going to make sure that I got my fair share, everything I deserved. I remember one evening as I was sitting in my office, reviewing the final paperwork before my meeting with the lawyer, Scott came into the room. He was acting like nothing had changed, trying to charm me with that familiar smile of his. But I could see through it. He was no longer the man I had fallen in love with. He was just a man trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. He sat down beside me, reaching for my hand. "Elise," he said, his voice soft but tinged with a hint of desperation, "let's fix this, okay? I want to make this right. I don't want to lose you." I stared at him, feeling a coldness settle over me. This was the same man who had betrayed me, who had lied to me, and who thought that a few words could erase the pain he had caused. I wasn't buying it anymore. Not after everything. My gaze was steady, unwavering as I pulled my hand back. "You don't get to fix this, Scott. You don't get to just sweep everything under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen. The damage is done. And I'm not going to let you get away with it." He seemed taken aback by my response, his face flickering with a mix of confusion and irritation. But I didn't care. The wheels were already in motion and I was determined to see this through. I knew that Scott's pride would never let him admit fault. And that's exactly why I had to be smarter, more strategic. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and finalizing all the necessary paperwork. As the day of the big reveal approached, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes from being resigned to defeat. It was the calm of someone who knows they're about to win. I had done everything I could to prepare, and now it was time to execute the plan. I had decided that the best way to confront Scott wasn't through a loud, dramatic confrontation, but through a calculated shock. I wasn't going to throw it in his face right away. Instead, I would let him think everything was still going according to his plan. He would continue living his life, believing that he had time to work things out with me. Meanwhile, I would be sitting back, watching, knowing that the tables had already turned. And so the day arrived. I arranged a meeting with Scott as though we were simply going to discuss the details of our divorce. He arrived early, just like I knew he would, confident and self-assured. He still hadn't realized what was coming. I smiled to myself, knowing how thoroughly I had outsmarted him. When we sat down, I let him talk for a while, listening to his pleas, his promises to do better. But all the while I could feel the power shifting. He had no idea that with every word he spoke I was quietly pulling the strings. Finally I interrupted him. "Scott," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I think it's time we talk about the real issue here. The one you've been avoiding." His expression shifted immediately. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to mask the anxiety creeping into his voice. I slid the papers across the table, letting him look at them. The prenup, his business holdings, the investments, everything was laid out before him. But what really caught his attention was the last line of the document. The one that said that I had taken legal control of everything that he thought was his. The room went silent. Scott's eyes widened, his jaw tightening. He looked at the papers, back at me, and then at the papers again. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You can't. This isn't possible." But it was possible because I had thought of everything. I had anticipated his every move and now I was in control. The assets, the business, the shares, they were mine. And just like that, Scott realized he had lost everything. The man who had once thought he was untouchable was now staring at the consequences of his own actions. I stood up, ready to leave. "This is your wake-up call, Scott," I said quietly. "You don't get to treat people this way. Not anymore." And with that, I walked out of the room, leaving him there to face the consequences of the choices he had made. He was no longer the man in control. That man had been me all along. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears as I stood up from the table, watching Scott's face fall in real time. The man who had once believed that everything from our marriage to his success was under his control, was now staring at the abyss. His face, usually full of that smug confidence, was now pale, his eyes flickering between disbelief and panic. I didn't feel satisfaction, not at first. The revenge wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about rubbing his face in the dirt. It was about justice. About showing him that the rules he thought he could bend would now come crashing down around him. Scott opened his mouth, his voice breaking the silence. This is some kind of mistake," he stammered, his fingers gripping the edge of the papers as though if he held them tight enough, the truth might somehow change. "You can't just take everything like this, Elise." I didn't respond immediately. I let him speak, let him try to make sense of the impossible. The only sound in the room was the faint rustling of the papers in his hand, and the distant hum of the clock ticking on the wall, marking time as Scott's world began to crumble. Every word I had planned, every action I had taken had led to this moment. I had been preparing for this for months and now it was happening. It was real. The power I had carefully reclaimed, built on years of sacrifice, sweat and quiet work, was mine again. Scott leaned forward in his chair as though he thought if he could get closer to me, he might somehow bridge the gap between what was happening and the reality he had believed in for so long. You can't be serious," he said, his voice now more pleading than confident. "We can work this out. I'll fix everything. We'll fix this, okay?" The desperation in his voice didn't faze me. It only confirmed the shift in power. The man who had once held all the cards now had none. And that was the point. I had nothing left to say to him. Not when his attempts at redemption were as hollow as his promises had been. He reached out for my hand, a gesture so automatic, so ingrained in his character that I almost laughed. The same hand that had once held mine with affection now tried to cling to me out of fear, trying to manipulate me one last time. But I pulled away before his fingers could touch mine. His words, his actions, none of it mattered now. He had made his choices and now I was making mine. "You don't get to fix this, Scott," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Not anymore." There was a beat of silence, thick and heavy, before Scott's eyes narrowed. I could see the flicker of realization, the dawning awareness that he had lost, not just the battle but everything. All at once his posture shifted. The confidence that had once been his armor, the armor that had made him believe he could do no wrong, was now gone, leaving him vulnerable, exposed. His arrogance, the thing that had driven him to betray me in the first place, was crumbling before my eyes. "Fine," he muttered bitterly, leaning back in his chair, his hands raised in defeat. "You've won. Take whatever you want. But you'll never be happy, Elise. You'll never find peace in all this." His words, though aimed at cutting me, didn't land the way he thought they would. In fact, they only made me feel even more resolute. Peace had never been the goal. Justice, empowerment, reclaiming what had always been mine. That was my peace. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding with adrenaline, and turned to leave the room. But as I reached the door, something unexpected happened. "Wait," Scott called out. I paused, not turning back. He sounded different now, broken. "What about the business, the house, our life together?" I had already anticipated this moment. I had known that the sudden reality of losing everything would hit him like a freight train. But his words, even in his defeat, still carried a sense of disbelief, almost as if he couldn't quite process it. For him all this was just a game where he thought he would always win no matter the cost. And yet here he was, the one who had lost everything. "I've already taken care of it," I replied, my voice cold but calm. "Everything we've built is now mine. I've secured it all." The shock on his face was undeniable. He looked at me as though expecting me to explain further, to give him some form of closure, but I wasn't going to indulge him. This wasn't about closure for Scott. This was about ensuring that he would never be able to manipulate me again. He had thought I was weak, that I was simply his wife, there to smile and stand by his side as he reaped the rewards of his actions. But I had outplayed him at every turn. I walked out of the room not looking back, the door closing softly behind me. I didn't need to see the destruction on his face to know it was there. I could feel the shift in the air, the gravity of the moment sinking in. The man who had once controlled everything was now at the mercy of the woman he had underestimated. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt something inside me stir. It was a feeling I hadn't had in years, a sense of liberation. The weight of everything I had been carrying, the years of doubt, of hurt, of misplaced loyalty, seemed to melt away with each step I took away from Scott and everything he had represented. I had won not just financially but emotionally. I had taken back control of my life, my identity, my dignity. I stood outside, the cool breeze ruffling my hair, and for the first time in a long while I felt like I could breathe again. There were still battles to be fought, still things to be worked out, but in that moment I realized that I didn't need Scott. I didn't need anyone. I had everything I needed within myself. And as I walked away from the life I had once known, I knew I was ready to face whatever came next. The future now in my hands was mine to shape. And I would do it on my own terms. Scott's betrayal had been the spark, but it was my strength, my resilience that would carry me forward. The power had always been mine to take. And now I was free. I stood there for a moment, the night air cool against my skin, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The chaos, the years of doubt and hurt, and the pain of Scott's betrayal, all of it seemed to dissipate with each step I took away from that house. For the first time in years, I felt like I was walking into my future, not running away from the past. The man who had once tried to control me, who had used me and taken me for granted, no longer had any power over my life. I was free. But as I walked down the street, I realized that this wasn't going to be as easy as simply walking away. Yes, I had taken back my control, my dignity, and my power, but there was still so much to process. The emotional scars didn't just vanish because I had signed a few papers. The hurt, the disappointment, and the betrayal still lingered, not in the form of Scott's presence, but in the wake he left behind. As I made my way to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something bigger, at play here. I had won the battle, but had I truly won the war? In a sense, yes. But there was still a lingering question in my mind. Was this enough? Had I done the right thing, or had I allowed myself to become consumed by the need for revenge? The next morning I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a message from my lawyer, a brief notification about the finalization of the divorce papers. Everything was now official. The business, the house, the investments, they were all legally mine. And for a moment it felt like a dream. The man who had thought he was untouchable, the man who had built an empire off of manipulation and deceit, had been brought to his knees. And I had done it. I had won. But the victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. Instead of feeling elated, I felt empty. For all the years I had devoted to Scott, for all the sacrifices I had made, I had finally severed the last connection between us. The marriage, the business, the dreams we had built together. Gone. But there was no satisfaction in it. There was no joy. It was just an ending. And with every ending comes a new beginning. I spent the next few days in a daze, reflecting on what had happened and, more importantly, what would come next. I had spent so long playing the role of the supportive wife, the silent partner, that I hadn't really thought about who I was outside of that role. What did I want? What were my dreams, my goals, now that I had taken control of everything? It was strange, this feeling of liberation. I had been freed from Scott's hold, but I also felt lost. The person I had been for so long, the one who defined herself through her marriage, her role as his partner, didn't exist anymore. I was no longer the wife. I was just Elise. And that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The days turned into weeks and slowly I began to rebuild. I made decisions that had been on the back burner for years. I started working on the projects I had once abandoned, the ones I had put aside for the sake of the marriage. I reconnected with old friends, ones I had lost touch with in my years of prioritizing Scott's needs over my own. It felt good at first to rediscover who I was, but there was still a part of me that wondered about Scott. How was he handling all of this? What would become of him now? Then one afternoon I received a call. It was from an unknown number, but something told me it was important. I answered cautiously, unsure of what I was about to hear. Elise, the voice on the other end said, and I recognized it immediately. It was Scott's lawyer. We need to discuss some matters regarding the business. Scott is, well, he's not taking this well. He's trying to fight the divorce, the asset division. He wants to make a deal. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. Of course, Scott wasn't done. He never knew when to quit. The man who had been so smug in his belief that he could control everything had now lost it all. And instead of accepting the consequences, he was trying to claw his way back. It was typical, really. The audacity, the arrogance, it was all the same. I considered hanging up, but something stopped me. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. Tell him, I said, my voice steady, that the deal was made the moment he betrayed me. There's nothing more to discuss. The lawyer hesitated, but I could hear the faint sound of shuffling papers on the other end. Understood. But you should know, Elise, Scott is not going to give up easily. He's determined to fight this. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window, my mind racing. Scott might be determined to fight, but that was his mistake. He could never win. Not now. Not after everything. And even if he did fight, I was prepared. I had been planning for this moment for so long that it no longer fazed me. I had learned to trust in myself, to trust that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. The next few days were filled with calls, meetings, and the finalization of every legal detail. The more I spoke with my lawyer, the more I realized just how deeply Scott had underestimated me. He had always believed that the prenup would protect him, that his wealth and connections would shield him from any consequences. But in the end, it was me who had the upper hand. And as each new piece of paperwork was filed, as each new deal was signed, I could feel the last remnants of my old life, of my old self, slipping away, replaced by something stronger, more resilient. Scott's attempts to fight the divorce eventually fizzled out. His ego couldn't handle the defeat, and with each passing day he became more isolated, more bitter. He tried to salvage what he could, but it was too late. His empire, built on manipulation and control, had crumbled, and there was no rebuilding it. Not without me. And as the dust settled, as I sat alone in the house that had once been ours, I finally felt at peace. It was the kind of peace that comes after a storm, after the chaos has passed and you realize you've weathered it. I had won. And more importantly, I had found myself again. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. No one else. Just me. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.